Yeah. So Alex, tell me, why are you an atheist?
I'm the basic point from which I start to think about in order to become atheist, or not atheist, but agnostic, and like have a confident point of view against a religion, is that I'm not able to see someone showing me that God exists in any terms. Like, there's not a way of me being able to see the existence of God in a scientific way. I mean, like, there are some people who don't like science and others who like. I tend to like the scientific method, and I think that the scientific method goes against certain things that make religion not possible. Like, you should be doing trial and error. You should go against your ego. There are some obvious others, like you should constantly be revising your thesis, and you should be like confirming the things you think about the world. You should evaluate something. You should be able to see something. So how am I going to see that God exists? In order to convince me that something exists, you should go and see how do I think in order to be able to show me that something which I will be able to digest. And I think that hasn't happened. Or maybe I haven't had enough interactions with people who believe in God. The thing is that I don't have certainty of God's existence. If he existed and I didn't believe in him, why would that be something bad? Like, why I thinking about his non-existence because I cannot see it be something which should be negative? Or so it all starts in how do we value things? How do you value something to be bad or something to be good for you? How can we make a standard of values? Why is killing someone bad and why is helping someone else good? How have we ended up thinking that? If we have certain rules which make helping each other good, where do we start from to be able to have that conclusion? Has God those same standards? So religious people usually say that God is all good and he only does good things. And then other people say, so if God exists, how does he enable suffering to exist? Well, I think that the standards he might have in case he exists could be completely different to the ones we have. How do we know that in like 10,000 years from now we won't have some different standards? I'm pretty sure that they will be super different to the ones we have now. If we keep existing 10,000 years and we are able to modify our customs and the things we do for the next 10,000 years as the rate of modification we've had for the last 2,000 or 4,000 years continues. If that continues, everything will be super different 10,000 years for sure. So those people will be completely different from people now. And if God, in case God existed, he will know certainly how people in 10,000 years will be. And if those people certainly will be super different from people now, why should he have the same moral standards that we have? And why should a moral standard be a thing? How do you start with a moral standard? How do you get into a moral standard in order to it to exist?
So you're saying that in, say, 10,000 years, say there's a different moral standard. Say, for some reason, then there are moral standards that all animals should never be killed. You should never harm an animal, Whereas now it's like, it's okay to eat an animal and stuff like that, But say 10,000 years down the line, they can't do that. So your question is, how can God expect one thing from us and something different from somebody else 10,000 years if we have, evolved, if we've developed in a certain moral way? Is that your question?
Yeah, so I think that God, in case he existed, he would expect us to do the same thing he was expecting people 2,000 years ago. God doesn't change his moral standards. He's not, in case he existed, I think that he wouldn't modify his moral standards to judge him differently to someone else. I think he will judge someone from the Middle East in the same way he judges a Catholic Christian from Spain from the 1600s. I don't know, that's a random thing. And if you are going to judge everyone homogeneously, why should the standard we have now be the one applied to everything? I really don't get it. I don't know why should, in concrete, this one from the West from the year 2021 be the one used in order to judge everything in case he exists. I don't even have the guarantee that he exists. So
I guess that the argument though for this on the Christian side would be that, there are certain eternal moral standards, this is one of the major arguments that Christians employ to prove that they're air quotes, prove the existence of God. And that would be that there is a set of moral standards in our world that we all adhere to, that we all know, within our heart that we should and should not do, like don't kill somebody, and love your neighbor, etc., etc.
But the fact that those moral standards are constant, I think that it's not because those moral standards are good, but because the alternative to those moral standards is the extinction. So
yeah. Would that make them not a good though? Because if the good for humanity is not distinction, then that would be a good.
but why do you think that to be good?
Oh, I mean, it would be a good. I mean, if we're not trying to die, then death. If extinction, if we're not trying to be extinct as a species, then we could juxtapose that to wanting to live as a species, and so then one becomes the bad, the extinction of our species, and the other one becomes the good, the existence of our species.
So the increasing of your likelihood of living will be positive in case you want to keep living.
Yeah. I mean, that would be a different set of good and bad, you know. But in regard to the extinction or non-extinction, if we value the non-extinction, that would be the good.
Yeah, but I guess there's no one who exists who thought that not existing was the correct thing to do, because
how do we know that?
Because they don't exist anymore.
Exactly. But if they didn't take the time to write it down before they decided to not exist, then...
Oh yeah, why is it then? Like, if I'm going to commit suicide, I would certainly write about it. Like, what are the thoughts in my head?
But if you think that non-existence is better, then would you really take the time to write it down, or would you just be like, screw it, I'm out of here? You know?
Why would you then think that? Why is immediately stopping your existence the most worth it thing, the thing that adds most value to you? Why is it? Like, what are the thoughts in the mind of a suicidal person? I would really like to see that. I don't know if there's any books out there which talk about that, but I would really like to see it.
Yeah. You know, there was a while back, a few years ago, where I was like really just trying to prove like the existence of God and like why that God exists and stuff like that. And I mean, it ended up like being kind of like unnecessary. It was more of like elementary philosophical exercise that I wouldn't necessarily agree with anymore. But part of this exercise that I did, I have to think back a little bit. It was, if there is life, then that signifies that we come from life, you know. And this, again, this is more not necessarily even hypothetical, but it's elementary and I wouldn't necessarily agree with it. But it kind of ties to this point in the fact that if I was trying to make the point that if there is life, then we have to come from something which is life. Otherwise, if we come from something which is death, then we would not exist, and that death would reign, you know.
But because you're saying that there's no way something which is alive to came from something which is not alive.
Yeah.
And how do you know that?
Well, I mean, so my basic premise was that, well, first off, I think the error in it was that I presuppose a creator of some sort, and I know that now you can't do that. And so I presupposed a creator, and I was like, all right, well, if there's a creator, or if there is something from which we come, which we don't necessarily have to know from the thing from which we come, you know, I mean, that's a way of trying to attach meaning to things, and it's not necessarily leaving that open to be, I don't know, you know, which would be, I think, more of the atheist standpoint of, you know, or agnostic standpoint of, hey, I don't really know, but I'm not just going to try to put a little meaning in there, you know. So what I was trying to do was I was trying to put meaning in there. I was trying to be like, all right, we have existence, we have life. There is something. And the fact that there is something shows that this something has to come from something else. And this is kind of like Thomas Aquinas, you know him, the philosopher. He was in the Middle Ages. I can't say which year. I don't remember that. But he was like one of the first philosophers to really try to create a whole philosophical structure around the Bible. And one of his things was, if there is something, it has to come from something, and so on and so forth ad infinitum. And then eventually that prime base would be God, you know, the unmoved mover. And so I kind of went off of that, and I was like, all right, so if we have something, because clearly there is something, then this something would have to come from something else, would have to come from something else, would have to come from something else, you know, all the way on back into infinity or something else. Or God, which is infinite, but yet that's why there's the name, the unmoved mover, because God would be infinite, but also God is also what moves and is unmoved. So it's like this base. And so then I was like, all right, well, if there's something, then we have to come from something. And the fact that there isn't just nothing it means that we don't just come from nothing. again, there are some logical errors in here though, because I'm presupposing that we have to come from something. I'm presupposing that, well, I'm also trying to, with my own mind, add something, to this world to kind of like create meaning from it and be like, all right, we have to come from something, Maybe it is something that's just infinite. Maybe it is something that just goes back until forever. This is the thing that I don't necessarily know, but this is a long rant and it's going nowhere. So I'm going to give it back on to you, hit the ball back to you.
Why would you say that meaning is valuable? Why would giving meaning to something be valuable?
I think that, a good question. I think that we use meaning to situate ourselves within the world. And generally, for me, it's like whenever I have some anxiety, or when anybody really has anxiety, one of the best remedies for anxiety is to find meaning of why am I feeling like this. I think many people could, unfortunately, an unhealthy way of attributing where your anxiety can come from would be, hey, it's coming from this person. I'm going to hate this person now. You know what I mean? And that could happen. That happens all too often, unfortunately. People attribute their uncomfort or displeasure with someone, rather than maybe something within someone or something within themselves that they haven't reconciled. So I think meaning is absolutely necessary. It helps us to show where we are in the world. Nietzsche, who the philosopher Nietzsche, the German philosopher, he first posited that God is dead, and he said that was actually kind of like a calamity that we've brought forth upon ourselves as a human race, is that God is dead and we have killed him, and by saying that, he doesn't mean like we literally killed God, he means that we have gained a foothold within science to end religion, stuff like that. I'm probably not summing that up perfectly well, but that was basically the gist of it. And he said that without God, with God being dead, he says that the scary thing about that is that if people don't take time to know the history of humankind, if they don't take time to know, where we are or how to situate themselves within the world, there will be rampant, madness and anxiety, because people won't be able to situate themselves. They won't have something to hold on to. I think that's what God in a lot of cases does for people, it allows them to have meaning and allows them to situate themselves within the world, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing. I just think that it can be a bad thing if somebody takes all authority saying, God gave me authority to do this, and so I'm 100% correct, and I'm right, That's where I think it can get bad. But as a meaning mechanism, I don't think that's necessarily bad, especially because there are many things that we don't know. And it's quite an uncomfortable thing to be like, I don't know where we come from. I don't know where we are. I don't know what this whole thing is. But then I think that you can either go the God route. I think that, all right, I'll attribute all of this to God. I'll kind of say, I'll say I don't understand this, but I'll say it's because of God. It's a mystery of God. But one could also be like, all right, I just don't understand it, and try to find some comfort in that. Maybe this is a question I don't necessarily need to know. This is the question I don't necessarily need to know the answer to. Because the buck has to stop somewhere. We have to have some sort of base. We have to have some sort of grounding. That's just the way that we are. If we don't have a base in belief for our world, if we don't have a base for belief in just our life, and say, we spoke about this in the last podcast too. It's like, if I'm walking along the street, and it's like I don't have a base belief or intuition that it's gonna stay solid underneath me, then I won't be able to take the next step without being horribly frightened and scared and fearing for my life. And so, which is why we need some sort of meaning. We need something that we can hold on to, which is unfortunate, but we're also finite. We have to be able to hold on to something. Kierkegaard's conception of anxiety, it's our realization that we're on the brink of an infinite freedom. And infinite freedom is something that we can't hold on to. It's too much. We need something to hold on to. And that gets into his conception of God and everything in our relationship to God. That was my long-winded answer to your question, why I think we need meaning. But why do you think we need meaning?
I really don't know that. But I will start saying that why is meaning needed? And you said, okay, meaning is needed because we as the human race need meaning for keeping alive. Because meaning is what makes you think that it's worth it to keep alive. But why is staying alive valuable? Where does that start from? Where does that came from? If you consider something to be more worth it than the alternative, it's because you've seen the pros and cons of something. But we're not able to see what it is to not be alive. So we've got uncertainty, and that's the only thing that is not enabling me to commit suicide. is the fact that I don't know what is behind death, and because I don't know what's behind death, I will try to live for as long as I can, because that's uncertainty. To which I think it's free to want to keep it alive, because you're not losing something for staying alive for an extra second. I don't think that in case there's something behind death, I don't think there's a trade-off between every second you lived and the supposed afterlife. So if I lived for 80 years, it's the same thing as if I died 8 years. So as long as there's not a trade-off, my incentives to keep alive are super high. And because of the uncertainty of not knowing what is behind death, I will try to keep alive. And that's the only thing that is keeping me from suicide, and the uncertainty of what's the alternative.
Yeah.
So basically, the alternative gives me out of uncertainty, basically infinite amount of uncertainty. I really don't know. I couldn't make a judgment of what there is after death. But I could say that what you are living right now is a compound of things which are stimulating different things, with different hormones and organs in your brain tissues being stimulated by neurotransmitters, giving like electrical shots, and that's basically what is making you feel things. So in the moment that stops, and you could make like an analysis of someone who died last week, and you could see his brain that nothing is happening there, like it's just decomposing. No more neurotransmitters are happening, or nothing is really happening. There's not more life. There's a huge difference between your brain and someone who has died. Like your brains are super different, and that makes me think that in the moment that you die, the thing I believe to be true is that there's nothing else. There's completely inexistence of anything. You're not able to process anything. So if the thing that is making you perceive that other things exist stops working, why should you suddenly start perceiving other things? Would you be able to use other hardware in order to carry like your mind or whatever, or your soul?
So, but the question then would also, I mean, in philosophy there's this question, I mean, within psychology as well, it's called the problem of consciousness. And the problem of consciousness is that we can't pinpoint what makes us conscious. Can't pinpoint the fact that I can move my hands, I can feel things, and I have all this stuff going on with me, and it's one homogeneous system that I can perceive. And it's like, I am the entirety of my being, and I'm perceiving the entirety of my being right now.
You're not homogeneous. You certainly know that you only see from one point. Your sight that only comes from one point.
Well, no, that's the thing though, is that all of your body and all of your psyche goes in to make whatever it is that you're experiencing. Okay. It's the entirety of like what's happening within your brain, but also what you're feeling within your body and your hormones and stuff like that as well. And you somehow have this humans and I mean species in general, whatever has consciousness has the capability to have this almost like control center to read what's going on in the body. And that's the problem of consciousness. It's the question is, how does this arise? Because it's not necessarily like a certainty that it arises from what happens within the neurons, the neurotransmitters within the brain. I haven't studied philosophy of mind extensively, so I know that there's a lot of work that's gone into this to show, hey, that maybe consciousness arises this way, or maybe that comes from this mechanism of the brain or something like that. I don't necessarily know, but I do know that is a big question in philosophy, is how do we get consciousness from all of this? I mean, even I have no source for this, but I've heard this before, and it's like scientists were able to create a worm, perfectly fabricated and everything, but they couldn't get it to live. So why does one worm live when it has energy, when it has some sort of mechanism to live, whereas the other one, when it has all the same mechanisms, why can that one not live, even though it's made differently? It's a little bit more complicated than just saying, when we die, that's it, Maybe, very well could be that our brain is what stores the entirety of our experience in the human world. But then our consciousness, which I would refrain from calling you, but just some sort of experiential entity or something, just some experiential something that can experience the entirety of what you've been through and what you've gone through in life. And maybe when you die, maybe when your brain shuts off, maybe that experiential thing, whatever it is, no longer exists in your body, but it still exists, but it exists without any notion of you as you are right now. So that's the question, is we don't necessarily know what happens after we die. But it's not necessarily plain too that when we die it's nothing. I mean, that's the big debate, right? We're never really going to be able to know this. It's all speculation. And there are people that can speak about this much better than I can. Because I don't know. I haven't studied philosophy of mind. I'm no scientist. But I do know that these questions are out there. And if they're out there and they're being debated, then they have yet to be settled.
But we have some certainties. Like, everyone who died, in case they kept their capability of thinking, and two, they were able to think about coming back to the world, and then they wanted to come back to the world. Like, those are three statements. In case those three happened, they weren't able. So in case these three things happened, there will be a fourth one, which is that they weren't able to come. They didn't have the physical means to do it. So what we are certain about is that no one has ever come from death and told us, oh, this is what happens. Look, I thought that it would be worth it to come back and tell you that this is what happens.
Yeah.
So that has never happened.
Well, what if their physical capacity died? What if, if their body dies, like I was just saying, they lost all capacity to think and act and be a human. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they've lost their capacity to experience. It doesn't mean, but then this is still speaking very strangely, just because the person, so we got Jim Bob right over here. We'll just call him Bob, and say Bob, he's a human. He's got every capacity to think and experience. He's got consciousness. Bob dies, and then whatever allowed Bob to experience or whatever consciousness arose within him, what if that also died as well? This could go one of two ways. Maybe him dying as Bob, he'll never be Bob again. But it doesn't necessarily mean that maybe he won't experience again. But he definitely won't experience as Bob again. That's for sure, because Bob's dead. So, but whatever was experiencing Bob as being Bob, thought of itself as Bob, that's gone. But maybe it's not necessarily gone experientially. Maybe just Bob is gone. The experiential part is not necessarily gone. There are very, very many things in this world that I think that obviously are yet to be explained. I think there are very many mysteries and such like that. Science is doing its best job to explain all of it, but again, we're way off. And the more we discover, the more questions that we actually have. And I think that the psyche is much stranger than space. It's much stranger than what we find in quantum mechanics, like just the mind and the brain and what gives rise to us. And there are near-death experiences and certain things that happen to people where it gives them some sort of belief that there is something that happens after life. I mean, there's even a near-death experience from a very prominent psychologist in the 20th century. His name is Carl Jung, and he wrote about it in his book Memories, Dreams, and Visions. Because he died for I think a little bit, like a few seconds. He was proclaimed to be dead, and he came back. He was resuscitated. And he described his experience in that book. And he's a well-renowned psychologist. Everybody knows who Carl Jung is within the psychologist realm. And so I think that gives me a little bit of, hey, I wonder what this is, And what he described in it was all sense of who Carl Jung was ripped up from him. And it was devastating. It was terrible and it wasn't fun. But he didn't stop experiencing. Just Carl Jung, who he thought Carl Jung was gone. That died. But the experiential part of him was still lived on. Not as Carl Jung, because Carl Jung is dead, but as something else. And so I think that's the big question. That's the question that we're only ever going to be able to speculate as. Because there are thousands of near-death stories and thousands of experiences which are totally unexplainable, which also to rip away any sense of who you are.
Are they all compatible with each other?
That's the question that's the thing that I don't know. I haven't studied enough of them. I imagine some are compatible, some aren't. If there is an afterlife, I'd imagine it's just as unexplainable as even just life itself. I mean, life is already a very, very strange thing that we take for granted, It's a very, very strange thing. Why do I have hands, Why can I think? Why can I speak, Why is there color? If afterlife is anything like life, or if there is an afterlife, then it's probably somewhat similar to life in some certain sense, probably just as strange, probably just as unexplainable. So probably have people who have certain experiences where they die and they come back. Maybe they're just as confusing and inexplicable as, maybe they're differing beliefs on the world. Maybe they all see something that is some objective reality, but they all interpret it differently, like we do now in our world. I mean, there hasn't necessarily been somebody who's been able to go do that and perform some tests and be like, this is the objective reality, you know? But there is a strange phenomenon where there's this psychedelic called DMT. You ever heard of DMT?
Yeah.
Yeah. Have we spoken about this?
Yeah, I don't know.
But so there's a psychedelic called DMT. And this is the strange thing about DMT, is that when you take it, everybody says it's like you die. And within DMT, you lose your concept of self and you're ripped from yourself, just as Carl Jung describes being ripped from himself when he has his near-death experience. But the interesting thing about DMT, which I think almost could be testimonially tested, which is not a high level of validity, but it still is some sort of objective reality if things line up. And people experience very similar things, if not the same thing. There are very, very many testimonies of people taking DMT, losing their sense of selves, and seeing the same exact things, which is interesting, if you think about it, because not everybody has the same psyche or the same mind, but yet somehow they see and they interact with the same things within the psychedelic realm, which is entirely different from our world, So that kind of gives me a sense as to maybe there is something else, and there is something else that's objectively present. Again, I mean, psychedelics isn't necessarily something that has been tested a lot, unfortunately, because I think it's very interesting. But the fact is that people lose themselves. They lose all sense of who they are. They have an ego death, and that they can experience the same thing because they didn't all necessarily die. Their bodies were still living when they did the psychedelic. But the fact that there is some correlation between their experience of losing themselves and people having actually died and having the same experience, it kind of makes me think maybe. The thing is, I don't know. So again, it's speculation.
So we could certainly argue that there's something enabling you to be alive. We could analyze centimeter to centimeter what is your body composed of, with chemically and biologically. We could see those things, which things are working and how are they working. But we couldn't go back enough to see why that exists. We could say that there's a certain scientific knowledge towards saying that evolution exists and that evolution has made this to be able to exist as it is right now. But whatever is making you be able to exist is a certain amount of hardware, which is composed of in a certain way. It's not a random way. It's made of a certain way, which is casually almost symmetrical, which is made of water, carbon, certain other things, which make you be able to live. There are neurotransmitters, as I explained before. And all those things are the thing that enables you to have the consciousness of what you have right now. Okay, consciousness could be a harder thing to explain, but whatever is making you be able to say that someone else is alive, you could say that that's made because of this, and this. So why should that exist? That should be the first question. Why should that exist? Because if you say, okay, why should this table break if I hit it hard enough? Because, the amount of strain it's able to sustain, it's limited. Let's say it's 100 pounds. So if you apply 101 pounds, it will break. How do I know that? Because I've already tried that with an identical thing. So if I do this other thing will happen. So when we exist, we should ask, if we exist, why is it that we exist? We should find a meaning. If there's not meaning, why should we keep living? In case we wanted to keep living, and we should go to one. Why should we keep living, and why should we exist? The first thing should be why should we even exist? What is it behind us, which has made us exist? And why should we value the fact that we exist and not decide to directly suicide? And that's a super hard debate because I don't really know where the ultimate value comes from. What is our goal? And if, let's say, we didn't have a goal, let's make the statement of a hypothetical statement. If we didn't have a goal, us believing that there was a goal could self-generate the need of a goal. Let's say even if we hadn't have a goal, we could still auto-generate a goal. So we could still be living a fake life, which made us believe that there's some kind of goal. I don't know what's your point of view towards that.
Some sort of fake kind of life that makes us believe that we have some sort of goal. Like a hypothetical situation, like we live in a simulation. The simulation says that there is some sort of goal in life, and that we go along with that. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I wasn't talking about a simulation, but
Yeah,
yes.
but just a hypothetical situation, you know?
Okay, in a hypothetical situation in which we don't have a goal, the fact of us creating a fake goal could be rational.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, it's like with, I mean, it's the modern day atheism. You live life without a meaning. I mean, really, it's not even just modern day atheism. My goodness, it goes back for thousands of years. You know, I mean, there's even a passage in the Bible where Solomon is like meaningless. Everything's meaningless. It's all just, you know, we're wasting our days under the sun and such like that. And it's a quite gloomy text, actually, but it's also very, very freeing at the same time. He says that the man's only good is to enjoy company and food and drink and to enjoy what he has done, to do work and look back and enjoy what he has made, you know, enjoy what he has done, or see that it is good. And so, I mean, it is, if we don't have any meaning, is it a bad thing to not have meaning, you know? Is it more fun to, like, is it more enjoyable to be in a life where we have no meaning, or is it, and we could do whatever with that, whatever we want, we could create our own meaning. Nietzsche also said this, that man should endeavor to create his own meaning, or that we have one's fixed set of meaning and we have to just, that's it. We have to go with that. Because I mean, even funnily enough, even within Christianity and people who have, you know, these great, fantastic meaning-making mechanisms of God, they don't necessarily have one set stable meaning. They change all the time. Their meaning mechanism is still changing. The way that they perceive and interact with God it's always changing. And the way that they believe in God and the God that they believe in, that's changing as well. I don't know. I would argue that if man saw that there was no meaning in the world and that would lead him to suicide, we would have suicided a long time ago.
Well, I could argue the opposite. If the existence of meaning is what enables you to use adjectives. If you say that something is bad, you should have a moral standard in order to judge it. But if there's no meaning, you don't have a way to judge that, because there's nothing's bad, nothing's good. You are not able to say that something is. You're not able to describe something with adjectives. You couldn't do like subjective valuation. This is better than another thing, and this has to be like this other thing, because in the moment there's no meaning, you're not capable to do judgments.
Well, if there's no meaning, like, we can still, doesn't necessarily mean that we can't create our own meaning, you know? I think that, say you get to the point where you have a super intense existential crisis, you know, you take a step out of life and you're like, reality doesn't make sense, there's no meaning, nothing matters to me, you know what I mean? Intense existential crisis. I've been there. It's not fun. But from that point, you really have to take a step forward, and you can say, all right, either I can suicide and go into the uncertainty, go into the abyss of I don't know what is, which is a very terrifying thought, or you can step forward and go into life, which is also at that point can be quite terrifying. I mean, for me, it was a very terrifying concept of I have no idea where I am. I have no idea what this is, but I have to take a step forward regardless. Either I take a step forward or I take a step back. And the step back is death, uncertainty. Step forward is life and uncertainty. I decided that it'd be a better idea to just choose a step forward, you know?
But you only chose the one which was less uncertain, because you have the certainty that you will be able to choose the other thing, choosing the second one.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely less uncertainty in life, but you still have to create some sort of form of it. I mean, there's also certainty in life that there will be death. You know, that is a certainty as well.
But you postpone the decision.
You postpone the decision. But also too, life can be at that moment where life, I don't know if you've ever experienced like intense anxiety. It's where the world just seems like a very inhospitable place. It's very, very almost terrifying. So taking a step forward into life at that moment, it can be a very scary, very, very, very scary thing. And from that moment, you kind of have to build something, you know? You don't necessarily posit that there's an objective good, there's an objective bad, but no, you build some sort of meaning-making mechanism, because we need that. We need that to survive. I would claim that we literally have to have some sort of meaning in order to survive. Otherwise, we would be retreating into a corner and our psyche would just unravel, and it would be a very terrifying experience.
I don't think so, because in order to go into a corner, you should be valuing that to be more valuable. Like you should make a judgment that going to a corner is more valuable than an alternative. So in the moment you stop making judgments, you simply disappear. So in the moment, if you keep existing, it's just because there's some kind of meaning behind it.
Well, I mean, because you can't simply just disappear if you stop making judgments, you know? I mean, that's not the way that the world works. You know, like your body won't just dip up and go, you know, disappear like that, you know? It's like, all right, I'm done making judgments. Poof, you're gone. It doesn't happen, you know? Like, we're here, there's life, we've experienced it, there's good and there's bad in it, you know? At a certain point, you kind of have to make decisions just to take a step forward and either be a part of it and play it the best you can and do the best you can, enjoy it the best you can, and whilst making other people's lives better, hopefully. But in order to do that, you really got to take a step forward and create something that you yourself create, you know, not necessarily something that's imposed upon you, you know, and that's the hard part. I think that's really the hard part, is creating something for yourself, you know, not necessarily ignoring, you know, all the things that have come before you. Because, I mean, let's face it, probably only one of us every 100 years is probably going to have a very original idea. And even that's going to be very, very affected by thousands of other people before them. But when I say to create something ourselves, and that's the scary part, I mean, it's a synthesis of what you learn and what you decide to learn and how you put that together yourself, you know? It can be easier to let people speak through you, but to think about it and to speak to those people who speak through you and to know yourself and look at yourself and create something out of that, it's a difficult process. And you don't know what's going to come from it. And I forgot where I was going with this. Yeah, how did I get on this?
I guess that there's an intrinsic value to life. If you...
Oh, yes. That's what I was saying. I mean, if we just say that life is meaningless, we could say that. We could say that all we want. And I would agree. I would very well agree with that, you know? That life is meaningless. It's very, like, from what we know, life is totally meaningless. But it's meaningless when you take it from the stance of not putting your own meaning into it. And that's because that's when life really gets meaning, when we start creating our own meaning in it.
So life is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah. I mean, it has to be, right? I mean, if we decide to say life is meaningless and we just sit in the couch until we die and degrade and erode away, that's a path that one person could take, because they took the life is meaningless path, you know? We could also just take the life is meaningless as the base, you know, say, all right, that's the base. That's the thing that we're working off of. Life is meaningless. But then from that, we grow meaning, we plant seeds, and we can live life in a multitude of different meanings that we create. But then if one of those meanings doesn't work out, or if it causes us pain, it causes us stress and anxiety, and it's ultimately not healthy for us, depending on the way you say what is healthy and what is not, you know. I mean, there are some people who could say that you should hold on to your meaning, like, you know, fight for a cause, regardless if it causes you pain and stuff like that. That's so totally fine too. It's like value, you know, like we were talking about the last one. But if it doesn't work out and it's ultimately not healthy for you, you no longer agree with it, then you should, and then instead of like having your world fall apart, being like, oh no, it's totally meaningless, you should look back and be like, oh, I already saw that the world's meaningless. I'm totally fine with that. Let's create a new one, you know? Let's make a new meaning. That's the fun part.
If you are saying that it's worth it to make the world again, you should have some values to be able to say that that's worth it. So in the moment you think that everything is meaningless, you are not able to build anything upon that because there's no meaning. And then there's no good or bad in doing A or B. You can just, you just like, I don't know, there wouldn't be any single judgment. You wouldn't consider going into the corner more worth it than not going. You would just not suddenly disappear in the moment you think about that, but just like, okay, there's no meaning. But as long as you have to keep living because you cannot suddenly disappear, you will start, okay, I thought about that and then I didn't disappear. You are constantly exposing yourself to new interactions because you are interacting with your surrounding. And then you suddenly start seeing some other kind of meaning. So the inexistence of meaning, even though it could be the right thing, doesn't endure for long because people tend to invent a new meaning. No one has ever built something from the base that there's no meaning.
Yeah.
You will always be starting something believing that the base is something of meaning. I don't know how to build something with the base of nothing.
Well, I don't know about that, because you could build something on the basis of there is no meaning, but it's not like you're building with nothing. If you come to the conclusion that everything is meaningless and you fully believe that, you're not still full of nothing. That doesn't make you full of nothing, because meaning and what's within you is different. That's just one belief that one can carry, is that everything is meaningless. Nothing has meaning. But you could come off of that. You could build something off of that. Of course, it would be from the basis of what you already are, what you've already experienced and what you've read and what you've learned and in the entirety of who you are, over your life. But you could build something off of meaninglessness. You would be projecting your own meaning into something that you believe is objectively meaningless.
So new meaning should arise, and then...
Yeah, it has to. How else are we going to get to a belief of meaninglessness? Some things have to fall down, in order for us to be like, all right, this is what was giving me meaning before. I no longer believe in this, and now I'll let it fall. It's a terrifying experience. It can be, especially if you hold on to that, that thing really, really hard,
Because of the sunk cost. You've invested all your life in something and then suddenly it doesn't work.
Yeah, but the more terrifying aspect too is that you have developed some sort of psychological structure and attachment to it. You've built some of who you are, and actually it could affect you in quite a physiological way. It could make you actually feel like you're dying in a certain sense. It obviously depends on the person, of course. It depends on the intensity of it. But the psyche is a huge part of who we are. It can be a very fragile thing, especially if much of who we are has been developed out of one sort of meaning-making mechanism. So if that falls down and the entirety of who we are falls down with it, who knows what could happen to a person? Extreme anxiety, depression, many things could happen. Or worse, not worse. Extreme anxiety and depression are pretty bad. But, they could literally feel like they're having an ego death, which is possible. But from there, from the basis of your world collapsing, you could build it off of another thing, which you say, this is the meaning, this is the objective meaning. Or you could build it off of, this is the objective meaning, and that is that it is meaningless. And that gives you, I'd say the secondary, gives you a lot more freedom to choose, has meaning for me, this has meaning for me, without saying that this objectively is the meaning of the world. So that if you fall down again, you fall down onto meaninglessness and you say, I saw this before. I recognize it.
But I cannot find the way out to mind around the thing that you can build something upon meaninglessness. I cannot think about that. I'm not being able to cope with that idea. In the moment you completely sunk yourself in the idea that there's absolute meaninglessness, you wouldn't really do anything else.
I wouldn't agree with that. So here's the thing, we spoke about this in the past as well, is we're finite, we're constrained. We have certain limitations upon us. And one of those limitations is living, and so we can fall into meaninglessness and we could believe that everything is totally meaningless, but we're still living. There's no connection between, once we stop believing that something has meaning, and let's say that crumbles, doesn't mean that we're going to die, We're upheld by other things other than what we believe has meaning or what doesn't have meaning. This is not necessarily a question of how to live physiologically and how to not live, not physiologically, how to live physically and how to not live physically. It's a question of how to uphold your reality and how you interact with the world, So I would say that you can totally interact the world by seeing that it's meaningless. But, saying that the world is meaningless is in order to interact with the world from that, you would have to arise some sort of meaning, to interact with the world. Because if you say everything is meaningless, then you wouldn't necessarily see a point in going and interacting with the world until you decide, all right, everything's meaningless. I'm going to decide to continue living, or everything's meaningless. I'm going to decide to die. Because when you see that everything's meaningless, you still live physically. So then you have to make a decision. You have to make a decision whether you should live or whether you die.
Why is the fact of making a decision good or bad? Why do you have to make a decision? Why cannot you stay in between without making it?
If someone truly falls upon the belief that everything is meaningless, you can't necessarily take a step forward in life. Maybe. I mean,
There's no meaning.
you would have to at a certain point. If you don't kill yourself, you have to continue living, because if you swept up, like, you'll have to go pee, you'll get hungry, you'll ascribe meaning to those things,
Or you could just want to keep living in order to postpone the decision making.
You could do that too, but at the same time, you also have emotions at play, and which one is going to be? I mean, that was going to make you miserable if you always just stay in the everything's meaningless category, and you ascribe and you decide to not make your own meaning. That could be a very miserable existence. Just, I am just going to eat and drink water and go pee when I have to, and just sit and be like, nothing matters.
Yeah.
That's like depression at its core, no?
Pure depression leads to suicide, because you believe that it's more worth it your inexistence than your existence. But once you have absolute zero meaning in life, you are indifferent to everything. So you are indifferent to the thing of being indifferent. So you don't care about the decision making. You just stay there until you crave for food, and then you have to go for food. But in that moment, if you go deep enough, you will want to create a correlation between your physical state and your mental state, which is in your mental state will already be at meaninglessness for a while, until your emotions bring you back to some kind of meaning. But if you are able to be strong enough mentally and stay in meaninglessness, I think that you will keep wanting to make a correlation between your mental state and your physical state, and the only way to make it is not do anything. Like, whatever if let's say you dehydrate, you shouldn't make a thing about it, because you don't care about getting dehydrated, because you don't care about your body, and you don't care about anything.
Well, then you've chosen to die.
You haven't chosen.
You have chosen, because to not drink and not eat, you've chosen to not drink and not eat.
The thing, not choosing leads you to die. Okay, that's true, but you haven't chosen that. Like,
you've chosen to not choose.
Yeah. But
So
that leads to a certain amount of things, which is true. Okay, if I stop choosing to either eat or not eat, I won't eat half. I won't eat the half amount of food required to live. I will just eat zero, because I will stop doing judgments. But I think that's not possible, because that goes against our human DNA. We're not designed to do that, and I think that because of evolution, people, if a human or if a living being has been able to do this, has already been extinct.
Yeah.
So I think that us thinking about the fact that if in case someone was able to think about this for long enough, there would be extinct. This is a step forward in the psychological thinking way. I mean.
Yeah. Someone that's been allowed to survive. Yeah.
So you are alive precisely because you're the people your ancestors weren't able to stay in the position of meaninglessness, because if they were, they would just died, because it leads to death.
I mean, but what I was saying before is you can maintain a position of meaninglessness, but from that, in order to survive and live and choose life, you would have to create meaning. We're finding common ground here.
Why should you? No, I don't think that's true, because why would you seek to create meaning if you are absolutely meaningless?
Well, no, that's the thing though, is that you could work from a basis of meaninglessness. You could.
How?
But you'd have to create. This is it's almost like a paradox in a certain sense, because you could recognize that everything is meaningless, but then in order to actually live, you need to create some sort of meaning. And if you desire to live more than you desire not to live, you'd have to create some sort of meaning.
But there's nothing you
desire. It doesn't mean that you recognize that meaninglessness is the ultimate if you realize that you can also create meaning at the same time. Because one could see that objectively everything is meaningless, which is very plain to see, especially, within what we know from modern science. We're going to die one day. Everything's going to be all turned to dust and ash. Objectively, one could see that everything's meaningless. But to live subjectively as if everything is meaningless, this is where we find common ground. We wouldn't be able to live subjectively as if everything's meaningless. Yeah. That's why you have to add some subjective meaning to your life. That's what I'm saying. You could live as if everything is meaningless, which, you could say that, yes, everything's meaningless. but you create subjective meaning in order to live, interact with people around you, you know? But the nice thing about objective, like realizing that everything is meaningless objectively, is that you can create a subjective meaning, and if it fails and you recognize you're wrong, you've been going the wrong path, you can let it fall and be like, all right, well, everything's meaningless anyway, so let's just create another one, you know? Doesn't really matter, you know? Let's do something else, which I think now is right.
But as long as it doesn't really matter, you wouldn't think that it's worth it to do anything. So if you go deep enough into meaninglessness, you will lock yourself there, and you will stop making decisions.
I don't think so. Well, I mean, because you can recognize that everything is meaningless and you still make decisions, you know?
But you only think about that superficially. If you go deep enough, and if you really believe in that, and if you have that until the last, if you are sure about that until the last of consequences, you won't see a meaning in doing anything else than not doing anything.
Yes. Okay. I see where you're going with this. This definitely makes sense, but at the same time, we're still constrained with our emotions. We're still constrained with our feelings. We're still constrained with being a human being, you know? And so if we go deep enough into meaninglessness, you know, that could lead you to be like, all right, screw it. World, life, I don't care anymore. It doesn't matter to me, you know? But it doesn't necessarily mean that you wouldn't want to do anything. Because one could say that everything is meaningless, but still want to live life. One could say that, I mean, let's think of an example. I don't know, like creating, say you have $1 billion, you know? You want to create a restaurant. It's not going to do anything for you. Totally meaningless, but yet you still want to do it, you know?
Why then?
For the simple enjoyment out of it.
But there's no enjoyment if there's no meaning.
Not necessarily, no?
I don't think so. I think that the only thing that keeps you alive, once the thing that is making you not able to think about meaningless in a full way, is your human instinct. The thing, because of the fact that if someone was able to think about meaninglessness deep enough and really realize that meaninglessness is the true thing, that those people will have already been extinct. So the survival bias makes us not be able to do that, because people who were, or I could guess now that people who were would have already gone extinct. So we aren't able to think about that.
So I think that we're operating under maybe two different definitions of meaninglessness then here. For someone to have a certain belief system, you know, like say, we'll go back to the God question. Say you don't believe in God, I say I do believe in God. So under one definition of meaninglessness, it could be like anything that I do, anything that happens to me in my life, it doesn't really matter. Nothing really matters because I'm going to die one day and it doesn't matter. But then could also be this other side of meaninglessness of, hey, like I don't matter. Like this life doesn't matter. I should just end it right here.
Both things are true. Neither of the two things.
Yes, matter. But you see, this one says that like everything is meaningless, and so I don't care about my life, and I'll end it right here. This one says that everything is meaningless, it doesn't matter, so may as well enjoy it. So we're working on almost maybe under two different definitions of meaninglessness.
The first one has some kind of meaning. The first one has...
The first one, no, but first one you posit some sort of meaning. This one you don't posit meaning.
But the positive of meaning comes from the human instinct of the thing that is making you want to keep alive.
Well, so here's the thing, is that actually I heard an interesting example recently. You ever seen the movie La Vita Bella? It's a movie where dad and his son were taken to a Jewish extermination camp in World War II, and they're Jews. And his dad basically created this whole like game to shield his son from the harsh reality that they're in an extermination camp, you know? And so I heard an interesting interpretation of it recently where it would have actually been a better movie if the son knew that the dad was creating this whole game but still played along with it anyways. You know?
To please him.
To please him and to enjoy it and to almost like ignore the fact that he is also in an extermination camp but still try to go along with it anyways, as if he isn't in one.
And I could say that it would be even a better movie to say that that knew, that the son knew, that the dad knew. So you could go farther and farther in the chain of knowledgeableness.
Yeah, but here's the point that I'm making is with this meaninglessness, the one where it's you create your own meaning, it's almost like a paradox of meaninglessness, because you say that everything's meaningless, but then at the same time you posit your own meaning in order to continue existing. Because the whole time where you posit your meaning, you still recognize that it doesn't actually matter and that it's still meaningless. But for some reason, you still value the meaning more than the meaninglessness, even though you recognize that everything's meaningless. Whereas on this side, on the other side where it's the death affirming side of meaninglessness, you say, all right, everything's meaningless. I'm not going to try to trick myself into thinking that things are meaningless. I'm just going to die. Like, screw it. Don't care. Because this side you have chosen to go the path of everything's meaningless. I'd rather die.
Oh, you wouldn't think that dying is more worth it than staying alive. You would just stop doing judgments, and that will lead you to die. But you don't care about that either.
You cannot just not make a judgment. That's what we're working with here.
You could go into absolute indifference towards everything.
Well, the point that I was making earlier too, though, is that we live within constraints. I mean, you even said this yourself, and with human instinct, we can't just sit back and not make a decision. And so anybody who says that life is meaningless and dies because of that, they have made a decision to die because they've said that life is no longer worth it. Because we have to make a decision either way. We have to say either life is worth it, but it's meaningless, or everything's meaningless, but life is worth it. Everything's meaningless. Life isn't worth it.
But I could argue that I could develop infinite amount of indifference and just stop making decisions. And then the not making decisions leads you to die, but I wasn't choosing to die.
But you can't necessarily do that because we're working with our own constraints here. You can't just throw away human constraints and just create a hypothetical situation that isn't actually possible. We have to work with something here to actually get somewhere. And this is the point that I'm making is, since we have human constraints and we have to make a decision because we can't just not make a decision, either you're going to say the world is meaningless, life is worth it, world is meaningless, life isn't worth it. You have to choose one of those. It's an either or situation, And I mean, you could create a hypothetical situation. I could say, all right, I can not make any judgments and I'll die like that because you don't make any judgments. But the thing is that that's not possible. So I have a hard time saying why talk about that because it's not a possibility. It affects me in no way. It could be a cool plot for like a story, maybe somebody is entirely like they don't make judgments. Like there's an episode of, Fairly Odd Parents?
No,
it's a kids show in the United States. Timmy Turner, he gets all of his emotions taken away and he's totally indifferent to everything. He becomes like the coolest guy ever because he just doesn't care. And somebody asks him, hey, you want to do this? And he just does it. And then he's just totally indifferent. He like risks his life in ways because he doesn't care, But the thing is that that's not possible. A pure indifference and a pure lack of judgment is not possible within a human because of our instinct. We have to work with that.
And keeping doing the things that our instinct tells us to do is the correct thing. Why is it? If I had the plug, if I could unplug my instinct, should I?
That you could?
Yeah.
I don't know. Because I can't answer. I don't know what it would be like to have no human instinct. But right now that's what we have and that's all that I can work with. We
could say that the instinct has been created through trial and error through millions of years, but that's what made our instinct. And we've got like a kind of software that says that tells us that keeping alive is the most worth it thing because people who thought the opposite are already died.
Yeah, yeah.
So the only people who are able to live are people who have descended from people who thought that living is worth it.
It's possible.
So we are super biased.
Possible, also. We're super biased, but then regardless, we still have to work with our own constraints. We can't go anywhere other than our own constraints. I can't just say, all right, I'm going to fly and start flying, I can't just say I'm not going to have a judgment capability, so I'm just going to get rid of my judgment. We can't do that. I can't say I'm going to remove this link in the evolutionary chain so that I could be like, all right, I'm just going to decide to say everything's meaningless and turn off my judgment today. We can't do that,
That would be a one-way thing because you couldn't go back. If you go deep enough into an indifference towards everything, which is basically that, you couldn't go back.
And so you can't propagate yourself again, just like which is why it didn't continue on, hypothetically.
Yeah. It makes total sense that there's no one who is able to think about that, because if he was, he would already be died, or his antecessors would have already died.
Yeah, ancestors.
Oh, so could it be that the civilizations?
Come on, Alex. That's not so hard to pronounce. I don't know why, guys, but I wasn't able to say a few things correctly this day. But I still think that the message is understood. And in the end of the day, that's the only thing that matters. Feel free to give me some feedback if you think otherwise, of course.
Who have they have developed enough knowledge, they have turned into the conclusion that there's actually no meaning, and they have just gone extinct, and that's the reason why we see no one else in the universe.
Dude, maybe. I don't know.
That's a super hard question to answer.
Yeah, I don't know. It's possible. But yeah, right now we have to work with what we have.
So I think that Bear made a super interesting point in this episode, which is that being more pragmatic and less idealistic might be the correct thing to do. I tend to consider myself to be quite in the idealistic side of the spectrum in terms of pragmatism versus idealism. And I've come to the conclusion that throwing raw data into the face of people doesn't make them change of opinion. I've experienced this with different people in my life, and I think that this is definitely not the way of making someone change their opinion. I think that you have to give them the context in order to be able to judge if something is true or not, and make the reasoning towards him being able to see the reason why he's not correct. And the same thing applies to me. Definitely, if someone argues with me with some reasons, like for example Bear did here, like we should focus in what we can handle and not with idealistic random stuff which we will never, or we might never be able to handle. There's one other needed component in order to make someone else change their opinion, and this is to have the minimum hostility possible. If you are hostile to the guest or to the person you are talking with, he will not be changing his opinion, no matter what. He will be focusing on having a shoulder mindset instead of a scout mindset. And he will just try to make his case without reasoning about anything, because you are attacking his ego. And the fact of you being able to talk rationally about things without taking things personally will make you and the person you are talking with able to change their mind. And to finish this episode, I would like to say that I will be making the case of going towards being more idealistic instead of going towards pragmatism in one of the future episodes. I don't know what's the exact amount of pragmatism needed in order to not die, but I really think that some kind of idealism leads to the maximization of prosperity in the long and in the medium term. In the short term, definitely, if you only want to live maximum prosperity possible in the short term, absolute pragmatism could be the thing to do. But in the long term, if you are pragmatist, you will not get into some conclusions that have already changed the world a few times. Hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you enjoy the one next week about the unfairness of Emilio's beard. Stay tuned